We've all watched with hope the inauguration of President Biden, bringing to an end one of the most destructive and divisive periods in post-war American political history. Just as we have all watched in horror how the great American democracy has been ripped apart in the extraordinary events of the last few weeks. So how on earth did it get to this? Donald Trump may have lit the match that detonated his country's turmoil, but it was Rupert Murdoch who diligently crammed the joint full of explosives. Murdoch's systematic manipulation of American politics at large, and the Republican Party in particular, should ring alarm bells throughout our nation, Australia, as well. Over the last 25 years, Murdoch has used his Fox News network to drive American conservatives from the centre-right to the extreme right, with an intoxicating diet of grievance-driven, race-driven identity politics. By the time Trump announced his presidential campaign, conservative voters had already been indoctrinated into a universe of alternative facts and elaborate conspiracy theories.
Saying it's a falsehood, and they're giving, Sean Spicer, our press secretary, gave alternative facts.
Trump, of course, added to all this. But Murdoch's Fox News legitimized it, amplified it, and turbocharged it night after night after night. And Murdoch's motive was all designed to accommodate Murdoch's hard-right business and ideological interests, driven by a combination of tax minimisation, negligible business regulation, and climate change denial. All three, of course, to be delivered by the far-right governments of Murdoch's personal choice. So what's the evidence for all this? My evidence is based not just on what I've observed having lived and worked in America for the last 5 years. My evidence is based on James Murdoch, son of Rupert Murdoch, who until last October sat on the global board of Murdoch's News Corporation until he resigned in disgust. When he resigned, James Murdoch stated that News Corporation were in the business of legitimising disinformation. His words, not mine. Then, following the ransacking of the Capitol in Washington on 6 January, James Murdoch was asked by the Financial Times in London what role Fox News had played in the riot. In reply, James Murdoch castigated proprietors as being as culpable as politicians who, quote, know the truth but choose instead to propagate lies, unquote. James said that election disinformation had been amplified, leaving a substantial portion of the public believing a falsehood. He said those outlets that propagate lies to their audience have unleashed insidious and uncontrollable forces that will be with us for years. James Murdoch added, quote, spreading disinformation, whether about the election, public health or climate change, has real-world consequences, unquote. And he concluded, we hope the awful scenes we have been seeing will finally convince those enablers to repudiate the toxic politics they have promoted once and for all. Friends, these are extraordinary statements. They're not from me. They're from James Murdoch, the son of Rupert, who has lived and worked at the heart of the Murdoch beast for more than 20 years. He should know. But not a word of this withering critique has been carried in Murdoch's Australian outlets, which control 70% of our print media. Not a word on Murdoch's Sky television network, which now broadcasts across 30 regional television stations and has more online presence than any other. Not a word on news.com, which has a huge percentage of Australian digital coverage. And not a word in the Australian commercial television networks either. Not a word on Australian commercial radio, and the latter, that is the commercial networks, because much of the rest of the Australian media is just too frightened to deliver any negative coverage on Murdoch for fear of retribution directed at them, and for fear that any journalist writing such a story will be blackbanned from ever working for Murdoch, who happens to be Australia's largest media employer. But beyond what James Murdoch has said, the evidence over the last 4 years speaks for itself. Fox covered up for Trump's mistakes, trying desperately to keep track with his shifting claims about the mildness or severity of coronavirus.
At worst case scenario, it could be the flu.
I feel like the more I learn about this, the less there is to worry about.
I was about to say the same thing.
It's actually the safest time to fly. Everyone I know that's flying right now, terminals are pretty much dead.
When Fox's news reporters found nothing newsworthy in documents relating to Joe Biden's son Hunter, Murdoch's New York Post, under the watchful eye of Australian henchman Col Allen, swooped in and, by pressuring junior reporters to put their names onto its dubious front page story, ran Trump's agenda. Like Trump, Murdoch's news outlets gave succor to the dangerous QAnon cult, with the devastating consequences witnessed in Washington just recently. It is now beyond time for Murdoch to stand up and denounce QAnon before it can fully take root here in Australia. And it's high time Morrison did the same. Our Prime Minister should be sending a crystal clear message to Australians that Trump proved himself incapable of doing before it was too late in America. Murdoch's Fox deliberately created one giant echo chamber for the American far right, making it impervious to the world of reason, evidence and scientific fact. Make no mistake, Trump may have been inaugurated, but Murdoch was never far off. Nothing can erase the fact, no matter how much Murdoch now tries to dissociate himself from the outgoing president, that he was crucial to Trump's election and to his most recent campaign. And Murdoch profited from the Trump administration handsomely. Fox News was buoyed by its reputation as President Trump's favourite network. In 2020, 6 of the 7 top American cable programs were on Fox News. And Murdoch's gamble also paid off with Trump's tax cuts, delivering Murdoch a $2 billion gift courtesy of American taxpayers. So where has all this left America and the world? It has left America not just divided, it may also have left America ungovernable, with two worlds within one country no longer capable of speaking to one another. The Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, the grand old party, the GOP of American politics, has been hijacked first by the Tea Party, then the Trump Party, and now the conspiracy theorists of the lunar right, and the Murdoch media has been the engine room of this entire process. This in turn is pushing a number of those on the traditional centre-left further to the left in a defensive reaction against these radical developments on the right, particularly on the questions of race. The result has been a hopelessly polarised America, where any form of political or policy compromise has now been rendered near impossible. This has profoundly weakened America in the face of the unfolding global challenge from China. Trump's appalling mismanagement of the pandemic within his own country was consistently masked by Murdoch's media coverage.
All the talk about coronavirus being so much more deadly doesn't reflect reality. Without a vaccine, the flu would be far more deadly.
The resulting economic damage to America has been massive as the pandemic has careened out of control. And Trump's make-believe world of fake news, alternative facts, and what would the medical experts really know was in large part made possible because Fox News had caused its captive audience to become a self-contained ecosystem that disbelieved anything put to them in the name of scientific fact. Trump, backed by Murdoch's Fox News, has done more to undermine American power and standing in the world than Chinese and Russian strategy combined. The same in Europe, where Murdoch's British media outlets have finally completed their decades-long campaign to drive the UK out of the European Union, resulting in a weaker Britain and a weaker Europe. Indeed, the West is now weaker than it has ever been because of the damage wrought by this combination of American and British populism, protectionism and isolationism, and where Murdoch has always been hard at work, hand in glove with the far right. So what about Australia? Murdoch is now working on taking Australia down exactly the same path as he took America. Sky News Australia, once dismissed as a niche outlet with a tiny viewership, is spreading its wings online. Its YouTube channel has 1.1 million viewers, a bigger base than 7 News, 9 News and 10 News combined. Its content is also broadcast free-to-air across 30 regional markets in every state and territory. If you watch Sky News coverage of the 6 January siege of the Capitol in Washington, it hit the same themes as Fox News in America. And it said, although all the violence is to be condemned, let's be honest, it's the fault of the meddling elites, they said, who refused to hear the truth about Trump's electoral victory and widespread voter fraud.
But the reality is, if it has been under attack, it's been every day of the past 4 years, as the swamp creatures refuse to accept the validity of Donald Trump's election. His crime is that he beat the crooked establishment and then set about draining the corrupt swamp that Washington has become.
What a lie. In Murdoch's hands, Sky News represents a dangerous tool to amplify Murdoch's print monopoly. And Murdoch will use it to expand his footprint to further radicalise the Liberal Party base and to increase its capacity to guide the party's pre-selections and leadership contests. The Liberals are now at risk of becoming a fully captured subsidiary of the Murdoch organisation. The Liberal and National parties would do well to learn the lessons of the American Republicans, who were so intoxicated by Fox News' short-term political usefulness that they didn't care if it also radicalised their base. However, over time, these voters became detached from long-standing Republican values and drifted into a culture of grievance that all government was evil, ethnic tribalism, identity politics, and the conspiratorial world of QAnon. So what's to be done? The Australian political class and many Australian journalists are just too frightened to engage in a full and frank national public debate on the dimensions of the problem and what to do about it. Morrison was too frightened to condemn Trump over the attack on the Capitol, which brought the American democracy to its knees. And right on cue, McCormack, his deputy, chimed in claiming some moral equivalence between Black Lives Matter and the neo-Nazi, anti-Semitic mob who ransacked the citadel of American democracy and tried to capture and kill Republican and Democrat senators, congressmen and congresswomen.
Well, indeed, you are talking about violence there, but we do have, with the Black Lives Matter protests from last year, those groups were protesting the death of George Floyd, and then we saw, what we saw last week with the storm of the Capitol building. Those people were surely just trying to impede the democratic process. So how are they the same?
Well, it involves violence.
And that's before McCormack blathered on in the alternative universe of facts and alternative facts, where he said some facts were controversial. Well, delegitimizing science, reason and evidence is not just happening in America, it's happening here as well. And McCormack and Morrison are so fearful of the far-right factions of their own parties that they will be bowing to pressure on these fronts as well. Murdoch's Australian outlets, particularly but not exclusively Sky, are now doing in Australia what they have done in America, pushing the country further and further to the far right. But in Australian public life, Murdoch is he who shall not be named, because the elites legitimately fear him. So that's why it is now up to us, the people, to bring about change. That's why more than 500,000 Australians last year signed a national petition calling on the Parliament to establish a Murdoch Royal Commission. A Royal Commission which would gather evidence and make recommendations at arm's length from politicians who are themselves too vulnerable to Murdoch's wrath. Off the back of that petition, the Senate will soon begin conducting hearings. Watch this space. I'll be delivering evidence, and so will Malcolm Turnbull. I'm separately urging Australians to join me in taking direct action against Murdoch's cash cow in Australia, realestate.com.au. by pledging not to use its services until News Corporation ceases its climate change vandalism. And more than 7,000 Australians have already joined me in that pledge so far. This year will be crucial in the campaign to establish a Murdoch Royal Commission, to preserve our democracy by tackling monopolies wherever they exist, including in our news media. With recent events in America, Australians have detected the whiff of gunpowder. And we haven't a single moment to lose. So join me in this campaign year of 2021 to defend Australia against Murdoch, that giant cancer both on our democracy and a cancer on democracies everywhere.